for houses of worship, understanding pay. Okay, good to go. All right, cool. So just to give you a little bit of background for those of you that don't know, both Barbara and I are CPAs. And I've been teaching nonprofits how to use QuickBooks for probably 20 years. I have a company called QuickBooks Made Easy for nonprofits. We have all kinds of training products. We have webinars. I went to a live seminar at a conference last year in California that was just for houses of worship, and Barbara was the one teaching it. And if you are a house of worship, and I'm sure that you are, you know that dealing with houses of worship is very, very different than the rest of the nonprofit world. And Barbara has an incredible way of tracking financial statements, tracking particularly designated funds for houses of worship. Without making your budget to actual look weird, where you can easily get balances in your funds, but you can also track your operational costs against a budget. It's actually quite innovative and cool. We got a 2-day webinar series on it that's coming up, which we'll talk about at the end. But before we do that, obviously, you got to see whether or not we're any good. So what we're going to do is this particular webinar is all about pastor payroll. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to you, Barbara, so you can introduce yourself to everybody. But just this webinar, by the way, is 75 minutes long, in case you're wondering. And we will go long if we need to get questions answered. And just so that you know, we have 169 people in so far. Okay, so that's pretty good. Obviously, there's a lot of people that need this information. So go ahead, Barbara. Go ahead and introduce yourself and take it away. And if you want to start sharing your screen at any point, you can, or I can.
I think I started. Did I
did
not
you?
start? Does everybody see the agenda? Yes, no?
Yes.
I see it.
Is the agenda?
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, you're good. All right. So it's all you
awesome.
now. Go for it.
All right. Well, I am super excited to be here. I've had my own business as on-call controller for 26 years. And one of my very first clients was my church. We had 200 people that met in a hotel room. And today that same church is using the same, is still using QuickBooks, the same methods that we set up back 26 years ago. And now we have 10 locations throughout the state of Arizona. So I've worked with the smallest of small churches to now what people would consider mega churches. So I'm really, really excited because I see a lot of issues with pastor payroll specifically. So today we're going to talk about just classification of workers in houses of worship, who can be a pastor. Maybe you've heard of the term dual status. What does that mean exactly? How do you determine housing allowances? We're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about how do you report pastor compensation. And then along the way, I'm going to be mentioning some concerns, some misconceptions, some problems that I see, some mistakes that I see. And I see it every day when I'm working with various organizations. So I am really excited you're here. I love the fact that I have this opportunity to share what I know, and I am trusting. I will just say I am a Christian in case there's any doubt. I'm trusting the Lord that he's going to help me through today. So here we go.
Oh, and by the way, and I'm Jewish. Yes. So there are synagogues here and there are mosques here as well. So don't worry.
Absolutely.
This
is for, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, this is for all houses of worship. This is not denominational oriented at all. This is the stuff that's on the IRS website. It's bringing it all together so you can really understand. So let's talk about classifications of workers. Basically, you have employees and non-employees, guys. If anyone is, I hear this all the time. We have a 1099 employee. There is no such thing as a 1099 employee. You either have an employee or you have a non-employee. So this is something to really understand. So I just kind of want to go through. An employee is somebody that works for the house of worship. The employer, which is the house of worship, can hire and fire them. Many times there's an employment agreement, even if it's just a handshake. The employer controls the schedule. They usually provide some kind of training and supervision. They provide the tools, they provide the facilities, they may reimburse expenses. They generally, that employee is entitled to benefits. And the employer determines the pay rates and schedule. Flip side to that is a non-employee. Those are considered independent contractors. They are in the trade or business that they're contracting for. They have the potential for profit, but they also risk loss. They offer their services to the general public. This is something that I see in churches. It's not specific about pastor payroll, but I see this a lot where church houses of worship will bring on musicians, for example. That's not their business, right? They're just being a musician for the purpose of the house of worship, and yet the house of worship paying them as an independent contractor when that's not really their business. It's just a hobby for them. So they should really be employees. That's another whole that's another whole webinar though on that. But anyway, there's usually a contract. Non-employees control their schedule, what gets done, how it gets done. They carry their own insurance. They control the pricing. They pay their own expenses. They invoice for their work. They don't fill out a timesheet. That's another thing that I see, that they'll have independent contractors fill out the same timesheet that they have the employees fill out. They just don't do the whole tax thing. So be careful about that you're not kind of jumping over that fence. Really, it comes down to three things. The three factors are who controls the financial arrangements, who controls their time and supervision, and really, what does the person that is working for the house of worship, what kind of relationship do they think they have? Like if they were hurt on the job, or if you decided to terminate the contract with that person, would that person think they can go collect unemployment? Would that person think that they could go collect workers' comp? Do they think that they're an employee? So just wanted to put that out there right at the beginning, because I think this is there's kind of questions about that.
I would just add one thing. So
Sure.
And so that's why Barbara, you were saying that there's no such thing as a 1099 employee, because employees don't get the 1099s, right? They
Correct.
get and it is a gray area, isn't it, in terms of trying to figure out what is an employee and what is an independent contractor. So it's really important that you and your individual agree. The person who's working for you.
Right. And sometimes just going through this kind of a list will help you. Well, who does really train that? Am I providing the computer that they sit at? That kind of thing. So, so this is and that's why I wanted to make sure that you have that in front of you, because this is a great little checklist. We're the checklist mostly. So, but yeah, you're exactly right. It's the relationship. What does the employee or non-employee think versus what does the church think? Because it really comes down to control. Who's controlling the relationship? So, all right. Employees, just as Greg just mentioned, employees are going to get a W-2. Non-employees are going to get a 1099. And they have a new form, if you don't know. In the past, we had a 1099 MISC, 1099 miscellaneous. That is now being split. There's still a 1099 miscellaneous, but for non-employees, we have a new form called a 1099 NEC, non-employee compensation. It's the only thing on this particular form is non-employee compensation. It's really clean, and QuickBooks, I love it. They're going to allow us to still do a 1099 miscellaneous if you need it for, say, rents or royalties. I know a lot of houses of worship have developed their own music, and they might pay royalties to those musicians. So that still is available, but for purposes of payroll, if they're an employee, they get a W-2. If they're a non-employee, they get a 1099, okay? All right, so that's just kind of introductory. Let's talk about who is a pastor. A pastor must be licensed, commissioned, or ordained as a minister. They don't have to be necessarily commissioned by the house of worship that they work for. So they could have come from another house of worship, but they were licensed, commissioned, or ordained there, and then they move to a new house of worship. I see that often. They're considered a common law employee of the religious body. So going back to the employee versus non-employee, they are considered a common law employee of the religious body. And they're employed to provide ministerial services, one of which is sacerdotal duties. So a lot of people go, what are those? And that's the function of the sacrament. So depending on your house of worship, you might consider that baptism, communion. Some include baptism, some include weddings. It could even be spiritual counseling. And also a lot of times they conduct the religious service. They might be a teaching minister, and they control and they conduct the maintenance of the organization. So for example, our church is large enough that we have a pastor of administration. And so he does from time to time get up and teach from the pulpit. He does from time to time get up and do talk about our communion portion of our service. But his main function is really running the church, running the organization. So depending on the size of your church, you may have various pastors in various departments, and that's not a problem either.
So
okay.
I have a question for you. So ordained, really anybody can ordain them? So it's not like a license with the state or anything, right? So
yeah, that's a great question. So in denominations, they're usually licensed, commissioned, or ordained by a denomination. So if you're Lutheran or Catholic or Methodist, you probably have a governing body that will ordain that minister. Some of the non-denominational churches, they have their own ordination for their pastors. You can get licensed. I know that you can get licensed to perform weddings through the state, but we're talking about somebody that on a regular basis works for a house of worship. But yes, that's a great question.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. So let's talk about dual status. What does that mean? So this is straight from the IRS that a pastor has the status of an employee for federal income tax purposes, and they have the status of self-employed for Social Security and Medicare purposes. And this is where it gets so confusing. It's like, well, okay, you're saying he's an employee. They're supposed to get a W-2. And you're saying they're self-employed. They're supposed to get a 1099. So, which form should a pastor receive? So we have a polling question. Nicole, would you put that up?
I can put it up.
Oh, wait,
no, I can't. Nicole, can you put the polling question up about? All right. This question.
And, I believe all these questions might be together, so we'll just have to start with this first one, but we can always come back to the other one.
Oh, yeah. Oh, thank you. I forgot about the first one. Oh, yeah. So I'm sorry about that. So I wanted to know, what is your role at your house of worship? Are you the pastor, the treasurer? Are you a bookkeeper that's employed by the church? Are you an outside bookkeeper or an accountant? Are you some other person here? Love to have you answer that as well. And then which form do you think a pastor should receive? A W-2, a 1099, or could be either?
And you can guess. On number 2, you can guess, but we want everybody to
feel free to guess.
Everybody
we want to
guess.
kind of know where we are.
Yeah. And don't answer the other 2. We'll put the other 2 up in a minute.
Yeah.
So Roy, are you not able to answer the poll? It looks like you put it in the chat. There should be the ability for you to answer the poll.
Yeah, go ahead and click on the radio button there.
Okay. So a couple of them can't submit. And I think that's because if you're going through your the internet, your browser or something rather than the app, I think it won't let you do it. But anyway, that's okay. All right. So I think that's good enough, Barbara, right?
Okay. I have no idea how many people have answered. I can't see that.
36% voted.
Really? That's it? Everybody, come on, guys.
You know what? It looks like we have to, unfortunately, fill out all the questions to be able to submit.
Okay, so just kind of go in the chat. It looks like we have can submit but a W-2, Can't finish poll without finishing the form.
Let them go ahead and do the whole poll since we're here and we've wasted the time. Go ahead and fill out all 4 questions. This was our mistake yet again. So the next question is also, well, this third question, does your house of worship collect designated or restricted funds? Yes, a bunch. Yes, a few, or no. And then would you like to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, Quick Tips? It's a once a month newsletter. So go ahead and fill out the whole thing and then send it in. Are we getting more in now, Nicole?
We are. We've got 75% voted.
Okay, perfect. All right. All right. Well, whenever you're ready to stop.
Okay, and we'll share results now.
Okay, excellent. Okay, good. All right. Well, good job on the W-2. 77% of you said W-2, and that is correct. So we can go ahead and close that poll. And thank you for letting us know, the audience that I'm looking at also. So yes, so if the pastor works for the house of worship, they are going to get a W-2. And again, it's because for income tax purposes, they are considered a common law employee, right? The house of worship is going to control their work. They're going to provide this facility, right? The house of worship and that type of thing. So excellent, excellent job on that. If you thought that they were supposed to get a 1099, this is a really important distinction, because it affects and could actually eliminate their ability to get a housing allowance. So this isn't like up for discussion, really. You need to put it on a W-2, and we're going to talk about what the W-2 should look like as we go. All right.
So just if any of you that are listening are presently giving a 1099 to the pastor or the rabbi or the cleric, whoever, that's wrong. It should go on a W-2. And Barbara, that's for pastoral services, right? If they do something else, they can get a 1099, right?
Well, so if any income that's coming from the church is going to be on the W-2, a church should never issue a W-2 and a 1099 to the same employee, first of all, ever. However, if this same pastor goes out and works for a totally different church and is like a guest pastor and gets paid for speaking, that other church may give him a 1099.
Oh,
but the church that they work for should only give them a W-2 and all income that they earn. And I'll show you what's going to be included in all income in an upcoming slide. But yes, they should only get a W-2. They would never get both. And that's true of even if you don't work with only with houses of worship. If you're an accountant, an outside accountant, and you work with other for-profit organizations, that's true for them too. If they're W-2, everything they get as far as compensation should be shown on the W-2.
Okay. We've got a couple of questions on housing allowances. I'm going to wait on that, Barbara, till you get there. But Dr. Lenore Hill, and I'm not sure if I'm understanding this right, this may be something that is a religious term, but she wants to know if QuickBooks can create our shade orders and requisitions. Our shade, O-U-R-C-H-A-D-E. I don't know what that means. If you don't want that.
I think it's purchase.
Oh, can QuickBooks create purchase orders? QuickBooks can create purchase orders. Yes, they can. In both desktop. I don't know that you can do it in the online edition purchase orders, but you can do it in desktop. I need to look to see if you can do it in the online edition. I'll look to see. Don't worry about that.
And David Enck said guest preacher gets a 1099 of $600 or more. That is absolutely right. If they're not an employee of your church, you have a guest pastor. Sometimes they call it pulpit supply. Or maybe you have an event and you pay an honorarium to a guest pastor who is not an employee of the church, then yes, then those people would get 1099. We're talking, yes, that is a true statement.
So Brian's saying our minister's tax preparer was very insistent we mark the pastor as a statutory employee. That's just what you said, right?
They're considered an employee. They should be, yes, they should be on a W-2.
As statutory?
That's interesting. I have not heard that.
Yeah, because he's reading
the box is statutory.
IRS publications are, he's,
Yeah.
apparently the minister thinks he should be a statutory.
As opposed to not common law. Okay.
I don't know what a statutory employee is, to be honest with you. I'd have to look that up. I'll look it up. You keep teaching.
Okay. Let's see. Let me just see if there's any other questions here.
The other questions I'm covering, and they're about housing allowance.
And we're going to spend a lot of time on housing allowance because that's a big deal. Okay. All right. All right, so let's go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and move on then. So let's just talk about pastor compensation. I think sometimes houses of worship tend to look at, here's a pastor's salary, here's their housing is kind of something totally different, and here's benefits. And they're not, I like to look at pastor compensation should be looked at as pieces of one pie, okay? And of the amount that the board has determined that they're going to pay that pastor, a portion of it, a piece of that pie is going to be designated as housing allowance. And this comes into play because I've had a situation with one church where the pastor compensation was, let's say, $50,000. He had housing allowance of, let's say, $20,000. So his salary was $30,000, his housing was $20,000. Then he moved into a new house and he said, well, my housing allowance went up and to, let's say, $25,000. And instead of changing his salary and making that a smaller piece of the pie and the housing a bigger piece of the pie, he just applied to the board for the extra $5,000 to be proactively, and we'll talk about that too, considered housing allowance. And what he ended up doing was basically gave himself a $5,000 raise. That's not true. The compensation was still supposed to be $50,000. It just, instead of being 30-20, it became 25-25. So be careful about that too. Just because a housing allowance goes up, that just means that portion of the pie gets bigger. The salary portion gets smaller. That's an important thing to know. Salary is going to be included in income. There's going to be like box 1 of the W-2, and it's subject to self-employment tax. So this is where a pastor does not have Social Security and Medicare withheld because they're considered self-employed for tax purposes. So they're not under FICA rules. They actually are under SECA rules. So self-employment tax is paid as a separate form on their personal tax return. So I'm going to go through these little buckets here, these little pie pieces. The salary portion is going to be included in income for income tax and for SE tax. The housing is excluded from federal income tax and most states, except Pennsylvania for sure. I think they still tax that, but it's subject to SE tax. So salary and housing are subject to self-employment tax, but housing is not subject to income tax. And this is a really big benefit for pastors because not only can they get a housing allowance, but they can also deduct their mortgage interest and the real estate taxes on their tax return, but they do have to pay self-employment tax on that. So just so you know that. And then I put benefits in there because this is another area that I see houses of worship do. Houses of worship tend to be very generous, especially with their clergy. And they sometimes decide that they're going to help the pastor with either paying for certain benefits that are not group benefits, like personal health insurance, et cetera. Though that is also considered income to them. And it's going to be on the box 1 of the W-2. And we'll talk about that as I get into what should be included in box 1. But when you're talking about pastor compensation, you should be looking at their compensation as a pie. And these are just pieces of the pie and how how they're going to be taxed is just as based on how I have it there.
So I'm just because I'm trying to understand myself. So the salary portion of this pie is taxable for federal income tax purposes, but not for Social Security and Medicare on the W-2.
Correct.
Instead,
all of the pastor compensation is not, his entire compensation is never going to have Social Security or Medicare taken out. You never take out. Yep.
So if I'm the accountant or the bookkeeper for the church or the synagogue or the mosque, I don't have to withhold Social Security and Medicare.
You not only you shouldn't, you can't. If you're withholding Social Security and Medicare and then matching it as like a typical employer relationship, then it can void that housing allowance tax benefit. It's really big. Somebody asked me, what is SE tax? Self-employment tax. So self-employment tax, SE, the form is called a Form SE on the pastor's personal tax return. And they are basically paying both sides of Social Security and Medicare. So where a normal employee, let's say the administrative assistant or something like that, is going to have 7.65% withheld from her paycheck, and the employer, the house of worship, is going to match the 7.65 for a total of 15.3% going into Social Security for her. The pastor, because of this favorable tax treatment on his housing, is actually subject to both sides of the Social Security and Medicare, but it's called SE tax because he's self-employed for tax purposes.
Another way of putting this, just so that, because I've dealt with this question too a lot. So basically, anybody who works in this country, okay, and you can look at me on the screen here, anybody that works in this country, the government is going to get Social Security tax and they're going to get Medicare tax. Social Security tax is 12.4% of your wages. Medicare tax is 2.9% of your wages. I think, did I get that right? Yeah, 2.9. So if you add it together, you get 15.3%. So the government's getting 15.3 cents on every dollar that you earn. All right. Now, if you're an employee, just like you are, not the pastor, half of it gets deducted right off the wages. So you see it in your pay stub, 7.65%, and then the other 7.6%, the employer matches. But when it comes to somebody who is a pastor, it's not deducted off their W-2. So they got to pay both shares. And so suddenly it's called self-employment tax, but really it's just the same thing as Social Security and Medicare for regular employees. Everybody gets 15 cents on the dollar. If you're an employee, W-2 employee like normal, you pay half, your employer pays half, it gets deducted off your W-2. If you work as an independent contractor or you get favorable status because you're a pastor, then you pay all of it. Church doesn't pay none of it. And you pay it when you do your individual tax return at the end of the year on a form called an SE. All right. Yep. Hopefully that clears it up.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
All right.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about housing allowance. I kind of mentioned this in the previous slide, but a minister's housing allowance is excludable from gross income. In other words, not going to be in box 1 for income tax purposes, but it's not excludable for self-employment tax purposes. So it still needs to be picked up on the Form SE when the pastor files his personal return. A housing allowance is sometimes called a parsonage allowance or a rental allowance. Those terms are synonymous. And all of these slides, by the way, if I did a quote like this, I have the link to the IRS website. If you have any questions on that came straight from there, I'm using their words exactly. All right. So how do you determine the amount of a housing allowance? First and foremost, his total compensation, in other words, his total pie, must be considered reasonable compensation. Okay, so based on the amount of time he invests, his credentials, his years of service, in not only your house of worship, but in his, lifetime type of a thing. But then assuming that it's reasonable, assuming the pie is reasonable, the lesser of the three. So actual expenses, the fair rental value, and the board designated. And this is not necessarily, depending on what your board designates, these are not to show you like that always the actual expenses are more than the other ones. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just saying it's the lesser of the three. So actual expenses can include his principal and interest on his home. So his actual mortgage payment, his real estate taxes. If he's renting a home, he would have renter's insurance. If he owns a home, he'd have home insurance. His HOA fees, his utilities, any repairs, yard maintenance, even his furniture. Because part of the fair rental value is that they're assuming you'd have to have a furnished rental. So his furniture, his appliances. If it's a brand new home, he actually can take his down payment in the year of purchase as part of his housing allowance. The fair rental value is based on what would a arm's length transaction with an independent person, how much money could you get for that same home if you were renting it? So that's that. And then board designated is an interesting thing because, I will tell you that most boards will say, give us your list of actual expenses. And if we look at them and they seem reasonable, we'll probably approve it. And we're not going to have something less than that, but not all. What I've seen in some houses of worship is that they'll say, well, we don't know how you could possibly live on, let's say, 25% of your salary. If you have housing expenses of 75%, we're not going to approve that. We're going to limit it by maybe a percentage of income or a dollar amount. So keep that in mind. That's a whole deciding thing between the board. Sometimes they look at, okay, this pastor is married and his wife works, or if it's a woman pastor, it could be that the husband works, and the board will say it's a percentage of both of their incomes. But bottom line is it's always the lesser of the three. This is an interesting, go ahead.
Yeah, this is a good time to ask some questions here about the housing allowance.
Yeah.
So one person, Michelle, wanted to know, do you need to maintain proof of the housing allowance amount?
The best way, so first of all, that's a great question. The housing amount you should have some kind of a form. Let me just see if I have that. Let's see. You might have some kind of a form that says, here, fill this out, and this is the amount that it's requesting. And then the board must approve it. Okay. And so that's a great way. That's actually a really great way to do it. And they usually recommend that you do that annually. Now think about as you live in a home longer, right? You may actually pay off your loan. So now if you don't have a mortgage any longer, that goes away, right? So that's something to keep in mind. The other thing is, let's say that you paid off your loan, your home, and you're like, well, gosh, I'll refinance my home and I'll use that money to pay for my kid to go to college. That is not part of your housing allowance anymore because you did not use it for the home. You took that money and you used it for something else. So just keep that in mind as well. It's kind of a, I guess what some people might call it a gray area, but it's not gray in the eyes of the IRS. The IRS is weird. If you took cash out, if you did a cash out mortgage and you used it for some other purpose other than, say, renovating your home or that kind of thing, then it's not considered part of your housing allowance.
So if the pastor was audited by the Internal Revenue Service, they could look at this housing allowance and determine that it's too much. That does happen.
Yes, they could. And I actually, towards the end of my presentation, I do have a couple of resources, and one is really, really good about auditing ministers, and it just gives great examples. And that happens to be one of them. Where
let me give you another couple questions because I know we need to move on. But if members of the church are giving our pastor an educational allowance, which is paid directly to the church or paid directly to the college through church designated funds, is this taxable? So this is a housing allowance we're talking about, and the word housing is in it. I have seen these pastors where they feel like it's just a money bag, so I don't know that an educational allowance is part of this. What are your thoughts, Linda?
Well, so an educational allowance,
Barbara.
I know that a lot of, whenever it comes to an allowance, and I'll talk about this for the box 1, but anytime you're talking about an allowance, the question is it accountable? In other words, if the church budgets, let's say $500 a year for the pastor to get educated, and he can go to any seminar or now webinar that he wants to go to, but he has to account for that $500 against that budget, then it's not considered taxable. So he attends a webinar, maybe he attends this one is free, but maybe he comes and he attends the one in January and got a great deal for like $159. He would be able to apply that $159 towards that $500 allowance, right? But if you just give him $500 and he doesn't have to say where he spends it, it's income to him.
All right. All right.
Yep.
Let's see, just a couple more.
Yep.
And then I know we got to get going. So we'll do a couple more questions and then we'll just stop and you can teach for a while and then we'll start again. Our CEO is an ordained minister, but they're not a church. They're a regular nonprofit, but they're Christian based. And he does do ministries overseas and sometimes conduct services locally while he's teaching in our mission. So it's not technically a church, but he does conduct services while he's teaching about our mission, and he does it overseas. Is he entitled to claim a housing allowance?
Based on what I'm reading, there's like really interesting inclusions and exclusions, and I would suggest that you go to that resource that I'm going to show you at the end, because it's like a chaplain in the Army can't have a housing allowance, and I think something like that, but a chaplain in a hospital can, or vice versa. It's just, I mean, it gets really a bit convoluted, but I would just suggest that you read that resource because it's really good. So I'm specifically talking about in the churches.
And Brand Bradley, the minister, the entire compensation was considered to be a housing allowance. That can't be right.
Well, and that's where that board designated thing comes into place. It's like, I have seen that where a board will say, yeah, if your actual expenses are as much as we're paying you, we're going to let you do that. But it's, to me, that's a little bit iffy. Now, our pastor, when we first started our church, he already had another Christian ministry going. And so when we started our church, he said, all I want is a housing allowance. And we knew that his main income was actually coming from this other ministry. So as far as the church's portion of his compensation, it really was all housing. So I think it's you'd have to look at it on an employee by employee basis. If somebody's saying I'm going to use my whole 100%, I'm not married, I don't have any other income, I think the IRS would think that's not, like, how are you living? Right? Because there's got to be other expenses.
I'll do one more and then we're going to go. Wanting to know, if you decide the housing allowance and then the IRS determines later that the allowance is unreasonable, can the house of worship be penalized?
Generally, I would say the house of worship needs to be diligent in the approval of the housing allowance. In other words, they can't just carte blanche say yes to everything. I suppose they could be held accountable if it's unreasonable, and or if they haven't asked those tough questions like, does this make sense that this person could spend this much money in our area? Based on if they know where they live and based on their marital status, all of that. So I would say that I think just from an integrity issue, though, I think the church definitely has an obligation to be very good about really reviewing and making sure that is the lesser of three.
Donna was telling us that in a Methodist church, it's actually called a housing resolution.
Right? Because they actually resolve, and that's actually a great word, because the board is basically in the meeting, they resolve that this is what we're going to agree to. So then they're signing off on it.
All right, let's move on. Okay. Definitely.
All right, so housing allowance must be formally designated and recorded in advance. So if somebody purchases a new home, or their payment changes or whatever, they can't go retroactively. They can't go to the board in July and say, oh, I forgot to do this back in January. Can you change what you did? No, from the time, if they can go to the board and say, I need you to, would you mind adjusting my housing allowance? Again, the piece of the pie either gets bigger or smaller, and but it's always proactively, never retroactively. And then I'm just going to read this because I think it's really important. If the housing allowance exceeds the lesser of your reasonable compensation, the fair rental value of the home, or your actual expenses directly related to the providing the home, you must include the amount of the excess in income. So it is the pastor's responsibility to determine if they received any excess housing allowance, because remember, is proactive. So when they fill out their little estimate of what they think their housing allowance is going to be, they may have overestimated, right? And if they underestimated, the IRS doesn't care. But if they overestimated, the difference between the two is taxable for income taxes as well as self-employment tax. So this is really important. One of the things that I recommend to my pastor clients is they actually take their housing allowance portion, put it into a separate account, and they pay all housing expenses out of that account. This is all personal, on a personal level. And then, and they live on the rest, right? And they live on the rest. And that way, if they're ever audited, they can see, yep, I got, let's say $1,000 a month. I spent, $850 this month, but $1,200 this month, $700 this month, blah, blah, blah. And all at the end of the year, I had no excess. So but if they have an excess, they are supposed to claim that on their personal tax return as additional income. Really important. Okay, this is what a W-2 should look like for a pastor. In box 1, we're going to have total compensation, not including the housing allowance. Boxes 3, 4, 5, and 6 are blank, or they say 0. Normally, they're just blank. Box 14 should show the housing allowance amount. And then down at the bottom where you have your state wages, box 16, that is generally the same number as box 1, unless you're in a state where the housing allowance is also taxable for state, which I believe is true in Pennsylvania. Then it would include both of those.
I'm going to interrupt here because it's a perfect time. So in that box 14 there, they provide the priest a place to live, but the organization owns the housing. So there's no money at all. Is there a way to monetize or show reasonable rental value as income in the priest W-2?
Yes, thank you for saying that. I meant to say that earlier. So oftentimes the pastor has his own home, and now he's doing that whole housing allowance requisition, right, and resolution. But many, especially older churches, they actually provide a parsonage or some type of a home housing for the pastor. In that box 14, must include the fair rental value of that, the lesser of the fair rental value or actual expenses as income to that pastor.
Okay, and Marilyn has this question. How do you determine the fair market value? Most of our listings are for unfurnished, not furnished, but yet hers is furnished. So somehow she's going to have to figure out what the fair market value is of a furnished apartment.
Correct. Yeah. They're going to have to somehow maybe get a realtor involved and say, this is an 1,800 square foot home. If it was furnished, what could we get arm's length transaction kind of a thing?
And don't go crazy. Make a reasonable attempt, have some sort of backup for the fact that you made this reasonable attempt, and you're going to be okay. You're going to be all right.
Yeah,
all right, let's move on.
All right. So let me move on. So this is exactly what this should look like. The beauty of this is that if you're going, like our church, because we have 10 locations, we had over 300 W-2s. It's super easy to go through there and go, oops, there's something in 14. There better not be anything in 3, 4, 5, and 6, right? If you see something in there, you're going to have a problem. So just keep that in mind. So I love the fact that they make it at least sort of easy that way.
So
right.
box 14, let me go back just for a second. I'm sorry. So box 14, that's a housing allowance. And you're basically telling the employee what the housing allowance is, so that then on their own personal return, they can fill out Social Security and Medicare tax on it.
Right. So that they can include that amount for two reasons. Why box 14 is so important. One, it tells them how much to include in their SE tax form, but it also is going to help them know how much did we give you, and is there any excess compared to your actual. Okay. So for both reasons. And by the way, if you are using an outside payroll service and they are not giving that information in box 14, the church must provide a letter to the pastor saying, we gave you this much in housing allowance. It is your responsibility to add that to SE tax and determine if there's any excess. Yes. Good. Thank you for making that point. Okay. So what do we include in box 1? Well, we already talked about salary, and you probably figured out that bonuses. If you do any kind of bonuses, those would be included in box 1. Those are typical types of things. Cash and gift cards. If you give your pastor cash or a gift card, Christmas, Thanksgiving, Easter, any other of your high holy days in different houses of worship, those are considered taxable. They need to be in box 1. Reimbursed FICA. If you are paying the pastor's any portion of the pastor's FICA, or reimbursing him in any way for that SE tax that he's paying personally, it is box 1 income, period.
That's interesting, because you would be reimbursing them. Do you wait and do it when they file their tax return? Is that how churches do it?
Well, I saw one of the questions where they said, well, we send in his SECA payment quarterly for him. We're paying in his taxes for him. That's income to him. My recommendation is put it as part of your pie. We're not doing this anymore, but I'll show you a trick on that. We're not going to do this anymore. We're not going to pay this out and then have to figure out how to get that onto box 1 of our W-2. We do not any kind of it's not a reimbursement per se. You are actually paying his FICA for him, and you cannot do that. So there's no such thing as reimbursed FICA, but that's what they call it. And that's why I refer to it that way. Personal insurance. This happens, oh my gosh, so many times where a church will say, well, we don't want to offer like a group plan to everybody, but we'll reimburse him for his personal insurance. Box 1 income. Don't do it. It's just give it as part of his salary and let him pay his own personal insurance. Okay. Really, really important. Non-accountable allowances, auto allowances are typical. Anything that's not accountable, I mentioned this earlier, anytime you give him $500 for education and he doesn't tell you that he ever spent it, it is income.
Because I had Sarah Beth Levine. She gives the rabbis an auto and a phone allowance. So it's probably a fixed amount. Should that be taxable to them? Should that go
auto? Yes, auto for sure. If the cell phone is reasonable, I would say like, $30 a month maybe, and he uses, and you don't provide another cell phone for him through the church, I don't think I would get too anxious about it. But if you're paying for his $1,600 or her $1,600 iPhone in that, and you're paying for his, 3 family members, no, it has to be reasonable. It has to be a very small amount that you could say realistically, typical cell phone rates are 50. He probably uses it, 3/5 of the time for, church related things. We're going to give him $30. That I don't have a problem with, but anything over that is probably considered income. Yeah. Internet on a parsonage, that's part of the in-kind value of the property. So I would include that as his parsonage allowance in box 14. I wouldn't include it as income, probably. I think because it's part of the parsonage. Mm-hmm. Honorarium. So many times if they perform a wedding, a baptism, something like that, the person that's getting married in the house of worship will pay the church X amount for the facility. And then of that, let's say $500, and of that 250 goes to the clergy. That 250 is considered income, box 1. Box 1 doesn't go on a 1099 because he's an employee of the church. It gets added to box 1. So that is true. And then this is a big one, pastor appreciation and love offerings. October is Pastor Appreciation Month in a lot of Christian churches. From time to time, houses of worship take love offerings, and then they turn around and they pay that out to the pastor. Box 1 income. It's taxable to him, income tax and Social Security tax. You can't just go, oh, well, this whole thing is, we have this, and we get all this money in and everything you just hand over the cash to the pastor. Nope, must be box 1 income. Okay, I want to point out this little, what I call a bucket, a designated fund. So this is where we're talking about designated funds.
Let me stop one second real quick, just to let you know, because I know there's a number of questions in the chat. So what I'm going to do is we've got another 20 minutes or so, but we'll stay on late and we'll answer these questions. So don't go anywhere. We were going to get to every one of your questions, okay? But I just want to make sure we get through to the end of the webinar. So, okay, go ahead, Barbara. So you were talking about designated funds.
Yeah, just real quickly, Brian, SECA reimbursement is, yes, it's taxable. It's going to be on box 1. So now he's going to get taxed on tax. Just include it in his salary. Just say your total compensation is this portion is housing, everything else is box 1, and don't add stuff to it. That's the whole point of this. Like, just say, this is how much we're going to pay our pastor or our minister or whatever, whatever your house of worship calls that person. And this portion is housing. Nothing else gets added. I mean, that's basically it. Nothing else gets added.
So basically, if the pastor comes and says, hey, can I get you guys to cover this particular cost or cover that particular cost, they're basically asking for a raise at that point.
Yeah, they basically are. Yeah. They basically are. And So designated funds. I look at houses of worship as having 3 types of money. They have their general fund bucket, where they expect a certain amount of money to come in as donations.
I'm going to stop you again for a second. I know I'm being rude. I want you guys to listen very carefully to the things she's going to say next. So we've been talking about payroll a lot. I want you to forget about payroll for a second. I want you to think about the overall books of your organization, because this is where we get into how she is really figured out an amazing way to track things. So, okay, go ahead.
Seriously, guys, this is a game changer for most houses of worship when they really wrap their heads around this. So general fund bucket is the money that comes in regular donations and goes out to pay normal expenses of running the operations, including payroll, including facilities, including administration, all the ministries that you do within your house of worship. That's your general fund bucket. Your designated fund bucket is money that is given into the church, collected by the church, but somebody has put strings on it. They've kind of handcuffed that money and they said, you can't use it except for X. And love offerings and pastor appreciation are exactly that. They've given the money saying, I'm giving this for the pastor appreciation, or I'm giving this as a love offering for the pastor. And then it's up to the church to take it out of that designated fund and give it to the pastor now as compensation. Okay, so the beauty of using designated funds and the way that I like to see them is, I feel like when a donor gives that money, designates it, and tells the church you can't use it for anything else, you owe it to, and you accept it as your organization, and you accept it, you owe it to that donor to do with that money what they tell you to do. So a love offering is exactly that, right? They've said, I want you to give this to the pastor, and then you turn around and you spend it as compensation out of this fund. So really important. And then restricted fund, I'll just real quickly talk about that. That would be what I consider a long-term designation. So a designated fund would be kind of short-term, right? You collect it 1 week and you're going to pay it out on the next payroll check. But restricted funds would be more like a building fund, right? Long-term, you're going to collect the money. This balance keeps going up until you have enough money to be able to build that building, or renovate the sanctuary, or whatever you're going to do with that restricted fund bucket. But again, it's not the church's money to spend. Okay, so we have to set that money aside and we don't want it to be on the profit and loss. We don't want to look like we got all this money when it's really not money we can spend. We owe it to our donor to spend it the way we said. But I want to specifically talk about that designated fund as it relates to pastor payroll, because that's the love offerings and the pastor appreciation money is really not income to the church. It's really a liability. You owe that to your donor to do that. And if you hop on my call or the 2-day webinar in January, we're going to talk about this a lot, because this is so amazing when you wrap your head around this concept that it'll totally change the way you look at money in your business.
And I'll just put in a real quick, and then we'll move on. But we've got a 2-day webinar series that's coming up in January. But that's what she's referring to, and it's the first time I've ever taught this. Well, she's teaching it, and it's just for houses of worship. The goal is to give you a P&L compared to budget that includes all your general fund and operating expenses, so you can compare how you did to how you thought you would do, and also to segregate out all those designated funds, like the children's fund or the worship fund or the flower fund, and see how much you received, how much you spent, and what you have left, without messing with your overall profit and loss compared to budget. And we'll do the same thing for restricted funds. It's quite cool. But anyway, we've got about 15 minutes left, so let's keep moving.
Just so I think we had you answer the question of, do you have designated funds? Anytime that you are allowing your donors to tell you what to do with your money, that's a designated and or restricted fund. Okay, that's what I'm going to say. Okay, so here's a question. So pastors are self-employed for their SECA, and so most of the pastors' W-2s that I see is that they'll just say, don't take any money out, and I'll make estimated tax payments myself. And those have the craziest dates, right? April 15th, June 15th, September 15th, and January 15th. And they have to come up with this chunk of money 4 times a year that don't even have 3 months in between sometimes. But you can allow them to take that amount. Let's just say that they owed $6,000. They look at your last year's tax return. The pastor looks at his personal tax return. He said, I owed $6,000 in total taxes. So his income tax plus his self-employment tax. He can go to the HR department and say, take $500 a month out. And you can take that out, but you don't take it out as Social Security and Medicare. He can't tell you to do that, but you put it all in that box 3, which is federal income tax withheld. And likewise, you can do that the same thing for state. So he doesn't have to, he or she, sorry,
box 2
have to do
box 2.
Doesn't have to do estimated taxes. They can have you withhold taxes. It just can't be withheld as Social Security, Medicare, federal or state. So if I ever get into a situation, I had this happen with a church I was doing payroll for recently, and I'm like, you have a new pastor. I see he has housing, but somehow you didn't unmark the box that he shouldn't be subject to Social Security and Medicare. We reclassified that on his payroll, on his paycheck, to be all federal income tax. So we didn't give it back to him. We just reclassified it so that box, the box for Social Security and Medicare withholding would be 0. And we just added that as if he had paid that in. Okay. So
box 3, 4, 5, and 6 are always 0.
Are always blank. Always. Mm-hmm. If there is housing allowance, it is always blank. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Typical setup in QuickBooks, you're going to, again, piece of a pie, right? You're going to have your base salary showing up here, and you're going to have your clergy housing. If you pay it in cash, it's considered a cash housing. If you pay it in kind, which is like a parsonage, then you would have, it's considered clergy housing in kind. That's if a church provides the parsonage, the housing, okay? That goes back to that question. Very quickly, I'm going to talk about this. I have a tendency to get on my soapbox, so I'll try to make it brief. The IRS allows a pastor in the first 2 years of becoming a pastor to claim an exemption from self-employment tax altogether. Once they're past the 2-year mark, this no longer applies. However, you cannot request an exemption just because you don't want to have to pay 15.3%. Okay, this is right off the IRS website. You can't request an exemption for economic reasons. You have to be conscientiously opposed, is the way the wording is. And I'll show you the exact wording. It's called a 4361, the form.
And this is a form the pastor fills out, not the
yes, this is a very important thing. They never have Social Security and Medicare withheld by the church, ever, 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 okay? This is a form that is between the pastor and the IRS. So if somebody comes in and they say, well, I didn't fill out a 4361, you're supposed to take Social Security and Medicare out. I didn't fill out this form. That is not a true statement. This is between them and the IRS. Okay, but this is what, under penalties of perjury, when they fill this form out, a pastor, and I'm going to just read this, a pastor can only opt out if he can truthfully state this: I am conscientiously opposed to, or because of my religious principles, I am opposed to the acceptance of any public insurance that makes payments in the event of death, disability, old age, and retirement. Hello, that's Social Security. Or makes payments towards the cost of or provide services for medical care, that's Medicare and Medicaid. And I was reading an article where people were like, oh my gosh, like seriously, like I could opt out. I could invest that money instead. I kind of go back to the whole idea of, term insurance and invest the difference. Are you really going to invest the difference? But anyway, this form creates an irrevocable election between the pastor and the IRS. It only covers church income. So if he has a second job, he's still going to be paying into Social Security and Medicare on that job. Like he can't walk in and go, well, I filled out a 4361 and, he's working as a barista at Starbucks. They're going to go, I don't care what that is. We still have to pay Social Security and Medicare. So it's only on his church income. But here's the problem with this. He's saying, I am conscientiously opposed to Social Security and Medicare. And then, but technically he's going to have paid some money into Social Security and Medicare. And all of a sudden he has a difference of conscious that at 65, he says, oh, except for that money that I made as a barista. I have a little trouble with that. I think there's an integrity issue here. So, and also, But
this is only good for 2 years anyway, right?
No. You can only elect it for 2 years, but once you elect it, it's irrevocable forever.
But after 2 years, so you elect it, but then after 2 years, you have to start paying it anyway?
No.
Oh, I'm sorry.
If you're you have 2 years to fill out this form. Once you fill out this form, you don't pay any self-employment tax. Ever on your church income.
Okay.
But it's so scary to me because you're saying, first of all, you're saying that you are conscientiously opposed to it. So now let's say your spouse works and you're entitled to spousal benefit, let's say. But you just told me you're conscientiously opposed to that. Or you have people walk in your church and they say, I'm really having a hard time. And you start saying, hey, there's this temporary assistance for needy families. And here's foods. Did you know that we have a food stamp program, or we have WIC? And let me help you do that. You're saying on the one hand, I'm conscientiously opposed, you're telling the IRS, and yet you're counseling people to do those things. To me, I just feel like it's an integrity issue. So
yeah, I get you. We've got about, I do want to get to these questions.
Yeah.
So, good, we're
okay,
done.
just real quickly, this is what I was talking about, the Minister's Audit Techniques Guide. Great resource, great examples, and publication 517. It'll put you to sleep, but it is very good, all about payroll. So, yes, before we go into the 2-day seminar, did you want to ask a couple quick questions?
Yeah, I was going to do some questions.
Okay.
So are you ready, guys? Because I'm gonna shoot these at you, Barbara. So try and not go. I'm gonna start at the top here. I'll start with these. Okay. We already did this one, so that one's done. Okay, this is Ann. She's been freaking out. Counseling mentor, her entire compensation was considered to be housing allowance. She hand wrote the W-2 and gave it to him, but found no way to send it to the IRS. I simply filed the copy A in my file. So the IRS never got a copy of the W-2. So she's freaked out because she just hand wrote it. So I think she could mail it in late, right?
Yeah, I mean, technically you'd show a 941 with 0 zeros, but they really should get a copy of that. I mean, that's the accountability, I guess, if you will.
She doesn't know where to mail it, and she's got to have a W-3 in front of it. I think it's something we're going to have to help you out with on technical support or something like that.
Yep.
So Michelle is like, what is wrong with doing regular FICA? I'll have to explain it to the rabbi and the cantor.
I've had several people say that after I've worked with them. I would say, let me show you the IRS regulation on this. That's what you're going to say. I mean, you got the IRS behind you. They're going to support you 100% in this. And get me on the line. I'll happy to talk to them.
Well, plus if you are withholding FICA on the rabbi and the cantor, then that immediately removes any housing allowance, right? You could be in trouble with that.
Right. I mean, now is the IRS like really looking at that? They should be. And I think the more that we get away from the separation of church and state, I think the more that the IRS will start really auditing this, litigating it, et cetera. A lot of stuff around the housing allowances. Okay. But yes, if you have Social Security and Medicare, you're not supposed to have a housing allowance. It's one or the other.
Okay. So Laura says BCBSO online is a good resource for W-2 submission. I don't know what BCBSO
Yes, that's
online
the business. Is. Yeah, so that's so you basically can submit a W-2 online through the or directly to the Social Security Administration. Yes, and I thank you, Vivian. You're right. The W-2 goes to Social Security Administration, not the IRS. However, so it goes. Yes, it does go to Social Security Administration.
Okay, yeah. Sue. Let's see, our youth pastor was considered a pastor throughout August. She changed roles at the church in September, which did not fall under the pastor exemption. Therefore, she will have both a housing allowance and then have FICA for 2 to 3 months. Should I give her 2 W-2s?
I think I would. In that case, rarely would I ever say that you should have 2 W-2s, but the fact that she changed positions, I think I would say that you should.
If yes, is there a way to correct this now? If yes, is there a way to correct this now that I have only paid? Well, that's challenging.
Well, you could, if she had enough federal withheld, you could separate it. It'd be the opposite of what I said earlier, where you could, instead of putting it all into box 3 federal withholding, you break out the Social Security and Medicare. But okay. I guess the question is she still doing any of the sacerdotal duties? Is she still possibly, going to be teaching? But if it's totally changed, then I would probably do a W-2. And I rarely say to do.
I mean, to be honest with you, for me, I'd probably just consider themselves a pastor for purposes for the rest of this year to make it easy on you. But just make the housing allowance less. Because she stopped getting the housing allowance. Yeah, that'd be the easiest thing. And then just make her a regular employee going forward. Becky, during 2021, Becky says on a typical employee, we are required to withhold federal taxes, but pastors have the option.
Say that one more time.
She's just making sure, like, pastors have the option of whether or not you want to withhold federal taxes, but a typical employee we're required to withhold.
Correct. Right. Yeah. So many pastors just say, I'll take care of my taxes. I'm going to do estimated tax payments. And that's totally fine. But in my opinion, why not let the church withhold it? So you don't have to come up with those big chunks of money 4 times a year.
Clark says, if you are withholding, does the house of worship have to pay the amount withheld at the time of sending in the 941? It's the same rules, Clark, for everybody.
Yeah.
So you would have to have it paid in. You may have to pay it in once a month is usually what people do. They pay it in once a month. So you need to use the same rules that you do for any of your employees.
Yeah, exactly. If he has $500 a month taken out every month, you're going to owe it if you're a monthly filer by the 15th of the next month. If you're a semi-weekly, 3 days.
Can a chaplain receive a housing allowance? Is a chaplain a pastor? I have no idea.
A chaplain is sometimes considered a pastor. Outside of a house of worship, again, I'd refer you to this minister audit techniques guide because it goes into chaplains of depending on what type of organization they work for.
Okay. I don't know what a QSEHRA is. Do you?
A QSERA, yes, I've heard a little bit about that. I think it's beyond the scope of this to go into that. So
yeah, I'm not going to worry about that. Let's see. All right. So Clark, I've been waiting on you, but so Clark gave. It says, please explain down payment in year of purchase inclusion in that 1 year of housing allowance.
Yeah, so if somebody is purchasing a home and they know that they're going to make a down payment, they technically can include that in their housing allowance. In other words, out of the pie, they're going to get a bigger piece of pie for that year, but the next year they got to bring it back. So just, but yeah, that's actually, I looked at that several times in the IRS guidelines, and they said actually a down payment can be considered part of their housing allowance.
Okay. Let's see. Vanessa wants to know if you have to pay self-employment tax on the value of the housing allowance, and the answer is you do. Essex, we pay a pastor part-time, so the compensation is well below the fair rental value. So that's why they're saying that it's all. But then again, Essex, if the pastor's part-time, then you still have to do a calculation, right?
So if they're part-time and they're only getting a small salary, but they're still living full-time in the house, your housing allowance is going to be significantly more probably than what you paying them in salary, but it's still part of the pie.
Right.
You're still going to get taxed on it.
Right.
For self-employment.
I love this one. Mary, both the husband and the wife are ministers of different churches. So does that mean you have to half the housing expenses?
Well, thank you for bringing that up because I meant to mention that. Often I see not even different churches, but I see husbands and wives that are both pastors within a single church. You can have half and half, but regardless, principal residence only. So you can't go, oh, I'm going to have a cabin up in the woods and a house, near the church, and I'm going to take a housing allowance for both. No, it has to be primary residence, and a total of those 2 housing allowances can't exceed actual expenses, period. So you can't give them both a housing allowance and then they both say, yeah, we spent $12,000 each when really the total was $12,000. So again, if you have husband and wife, I would recommend they put that money together into one account and pay all the housing out of it. And if there's any left over, that's excess housing allowance subject to income tax.
All right. So Becky and Maria both are similar. One of them is like, can pastors in a small church setting take the entire salary as a housing allowance? And then the other worst person is like, our pastors work second jobs to earn a living, so we only pay a housing allowance. Neither of that's relevant. The housing allowance is supposed to be based on the cost of the living expenses, correct?
Right.
Or the lower of the cost of the living expenses or the fair market value.
Correct. So they can have a housing allowance, but again, reasonable compensation has to be reasonable, including the whole pie. So if you're paying somebody to work 3 hours a week, but you're giving them, $24,000 worth of housing allowance, that seems a little unreasonable.
Right. So I'm going to take a second here. We're going to do some more questions. I'm sharing my screen now. I should be sharing my screen anyway. Can y'all see my screen?
Great questions, by the way, everybody. Thank you. Because a couple of those things I meant to bring up and but the question helped me to remember.
What I wanted to show you is, let me get back to this. All right, let's see. This is what I wanted to show you. And let me go here. Can you guys still, am I sharing my screen, Barbara? Can you see a slide now?
Uh-huh.
Okay, cool. All right. So on January the 19th and January the 20th, we're going to do a 2-day training. So it's going to be 2 hours a day for 2 days. And this is a training kind of like my normal QuickBooks training, except it's just going to be houses of worship. That's all we're going to talk about. So we're going to talk about how to set up the accounts, how to streamline your data entry, get the reports you want. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about how to track your designated funds versus your restricted funds versus your general funds, and track your ministry expenses, create accountability. We're going to talk about how to use the bank feeds in QuickBooks where you can download transactions. And again, at the bottom here is probably the most important. We're going to spend time talking about tracking donor designated and donor restricted funds separate from your regular operating funds. So, and by the way, Donna Patrick, there's a shout out from her. She's like, yeah, she's in love with what you've done, and she's on the webinar. So anyway,
Donna,
this is normally, it's $189 normally. We're going to give it to you for $159. If you put T show 30, you're going to get it for $30 off. And to do this, you're going to go to our QuickBooks Made Easy website, and I'm going to do some more questions here. I'm not done.
Or there's a bit.ly link right there.
Yeah, there's a bit.ly link, but I'm just going to take you to the website here in case you haven't been here before. QuickBooks Made Easy. And if you click on courses and training and you go to webinars, you're going to see 2 webinars actually that we're giving that you might be interested in. One of them is on this one here, January 19th. This is the one I was referring to. It's $189 normally. You can click on it and find out all that we're going to cover. Then on January 13th, the week before, we're going to do getting 1099s out of QuickBooks for your desktop. And on January 14th, we're going to do getting 1099s out of your QuickBooks Online. Okay. And we're going to give you a discount on that as well. So let's see, we're giving you $30 off for that. And then I think here's the 1099 one right there. All right. Let's
really important and good timing because guys, these are due January 31. So if you don't know how this is going to work, you want to be on that call.
Yeah. And we've got 160 people or 157 people still on the call. So I'm going to do some more questions. We won't go forever, but we'll go for as long as we, can stomach it. All right. So is retirement paid on behalf of the pastor considered income? From Linda.
That is a great question. I'm assuming you're talking about that the church is paying that retirement, and yes, that's income. Oh.
If the church pays employer retirement, it's typically like a 403B or whatever.
Well, yeah, that was just what I was going to say. If the pastor has, because you created either a 403B, a 401k, a simple IRA, if you've created a retirement plan and he put the money in there and he's taking the money out, that's going to be taxable. But if you're just giving him money because now he's in retirement, it's income to him. Yes,
right.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Let's see. If you'd filed a 4361 and were exempt from Social Security and Medicare during your past career, but you had a working spouse, you will qualify for both, but you cannot do it online like normal. It takes a phone interview. Okay, so this is just somebody telling you they've been through that nightmare. Yeah. All right, so I'm not going to worry about that. Are you going over the NEC out of QuickBooks in the workshop? Yes, that's exactly what I'll be doing, Sue. Is health insurance paid by the church tax deductible? I mean, taxable by the employee.
It is if it's not a group plan. So if you're only paying the health insurance premium for the pastor and you're not offering it to all other qualified employees, then it is definitely taxable income. If you're saying, no, we offer a group plan and he was the only one that opted in and everybody else, you have a piece of paper that says I opt out because I have it through my spouse or whatever, then you can consider a group plan. But if it's not a group plan, it is definitely taxable.
All right. Anne is explaining to me she's not freaking out. Okay. Sorry, Anne. She files the bulk of them online, but the website will not accept a W-2 that has no information in box 1. See, she was the one who was all housing allowance. It will not accept a form that has information only in box 14. That's why I've done this one manually. The W-3 doesn't even have a place to put box 14. The W-3 also states they do not want you to see information if there's no box 1. So she can't file it because she can't fill out the W-3.
Well, I guess in that case, we always just included it in, of course, we had more than
it's too late
just
for
that
her,
one
though.
employee.
It's too
If
late
that's
for
the
her.
only employee, it seems a little odd that that's the only employee that you would have.
No, she had others. This was after the fact, I think, is what happened.
Yeah.
So
yeah, if it's after the fact, I guess I would probably say do a letter, but
yeah, this is one of those things where you're going to have to get an accountant involved to try and figure it out. Yeah. Let's see.
And by the way, I'm shocked at how many tax accountants that do taxes for pastors don't know this and haven't told them this before.
All right. Pastor love offerings are made from designated QB company, and payroll is from an operating QuickBooks. They have always issued a 1099 for the love offering. Should I just manually add this into the W-2? Yes.
Yes, you can add that to the W-2. In QuickBooks Online, they don't let you do that. So QuickBooks Desktop, you can kind of amend that amount, but it would be better to collect the money in designated, pay it out of designated, but you're paying it as a salary. And so
I would do a transfer from the one company to the other, and really you shouldn't have two companies. That's the real answer. You should have one company, Jan. So that's something that we might want to work on with you. Let's see. Let me see if there's any at the top that I still haven't answered here. Let's see. Do you have a simple chart that shows what applies to SE taxes and what applies to federal taxes? I don't know if I have anything. Do you?
Well, the visual that I showed, that's all box 1. Really the only, and then you add housing to that amount for SE. Everything that's on that little black thing with all the little circles, that's all box 1 income, and then you add the housing for SE tax. Easy.
Yeah, we already did that one. Okay, I think we took care of those. I'm going to do just a few more over here in the chat.
Heather says, I'd love to see a payroll on how to account for different programs. Yes, I've actually, Greg and I have talked about that, doing a kind of a whole payroll thing on how to set up payroll in QuickBooks or how to get that into the
we have a training product on it, but it's for the desktop version, not the online edition. Right. Okay, let's see what else do we have here. Okay, so we got that. We paid pastor's appreciation by check to a minister's appreciation fund account. Can I move it to salaries and wages? Absolutely.
Yeah, you would do that on again, it needs to show up on his payroll check. If you've already paid it out, you'd basically call the first one almost like an employee advance, record it as salary, and deduct the employee advance.
It depends upon how you normally enter their payroll. That's the kind of thing that we would probably help you with tech support. Yep. And actually, this is the other thing, and this is an offer that's only good until Saturday night. We have a technical support agreement where you can call us with questions. We can even dial into the software and help you. It's normally $4.99 for a year. We're going to give it to you for $2.99 for a year. And it's TS Show 200. Notice how that's different from this one, which is T Show 40. That gives you the $59 off of the webinar that's coming up. Let's see, what else is there? We'll take a couple more minutes and then we'll stop.
These are great questions, everybody. Yeah. Thank you.
Retiring pastor severance pay, is it $10.99? I don't think so. Would severance pay be?
I would put it on W-2.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Donna's thanking us for saying something about her. And see, office administrator, a W-2 person, occasionally does pulpit supply. She's ordained, but not part of the admin. It's not part of her job. The fact that she's ordained is not relevant. She's got to be actually doing pastoral work in order for it to count.
Correct.
Okay. Go back to the support sheet. I don't know what the technical support sheet.
There you go. Oh,
They're ordering me around at this point, Barbara. All right. So let's see. Nicole, are you still here? Because we're about 15 minutes over, so it's probably time to finish up here.
Yep, still here. So how are you feeling? Do you want to take any more questions, or shall we call it a wrap?
Let's see. Let me see if there's just something in here that let's see if anybody is really wanting. Wow, all of a sudden I'm getting all this stuff here at the end. We paid our priests some money to buy a laptop. Where can we place it so it's not compensation? Well, if he gives you the receipt of what you spent it on, then you would point it to wherever you would have pointed it to had you written the check yourself. Okay. Heather, you go to QuickBooks Made Easy to find that and go into on-demand training. Let's see. We have a pastor is transitioning a pastor. So I'll just read this. We have a ministry of our church. We have a pastor that will be transitioning from a pastor in our church to administrator of this ministry. Would he still be considered an employee and able to get health benefits from the church? The ministry is not incorporated. Wow. The ministry raises its own funds and reimburses the church for his salary. So it sounds like the ministry is a different organization. Mm-hmm. I think that's a question for it sounds like somebody's transferring to a different organization. I don't know that you could cover their health insurance or not. I think you have to ask whoever the insurance company is.
I wouldn't think so, but I would ask your insurance company.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so I'm going to do a couple more and then we're going to stop. I just love doing this.
You guys are great at it.
I'm a supply pastor and have always been paid as a 1099 contractor. I only work for one church. Should they have used a W-2? I don't know what a supply pastor is.
A supply pastor is like, I do know what that is. So a supply pastor, for the people that are on the call, is somebody that kind of fills in when the main pastor goes on vacation. And so they sometimes call it pulpit supply. And so he fills in for them. If you are ordained.
He's not ordained.
Oh, not ordained. Okay. Not licensed. You just are almost like a guest speaker. And you're not an employee of the church, or you are an employee of the church?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. If you're not an employee of the church, then you can get a 1099.
Yes, I think you're okay.
But it's interesting because the one little caveat there, I only work for one church, is interesting because as an independent contractor, you need to be offering your services to other churches. So if you offer them to other churches and nobody else takes you up on it, then I would probably say a 1099 is fine if you're not ordained.
All right. Okay, cool. All right. Well, I think if
it's every Sunday, W-2, I would think. Because that's a different scenario, right? Because you're saying that's not pulpit supply. You're in the pulpit. And why? Yep. And you might want to figure out the ordination for taxes. Then I would say W-2. That's because they're controlling you at that point.
All right. Okay. So why don't you go ahead and take us out, if you would, Nicole, because we'll go on forever. But these kinds of questions we will be able to answer in the 2-day webinar that's coming up. We'll be able to spend more time on it, and you can certainly get your questions answered with the tech support. All right. And I think, Barbara, it's fairly obvious that there's a big need for this. We still got 140 people on the call almost. And
wow. I'm so happy to see everybody on the call. I hope hope we got a lot of good information out of it.
All right, cool. And I'm going to try and pay. This is a song that Barbara likes a lot. So I'll play this going out. All right. All right. Go ahead, Nicole. You want to say goodbye?
Right. Or yes, I'll say goodbye. Barbara, Gregg, you guys are phenomenal. And this has been truly one of the most engaged groups that we've had in a long time. So really, thank you to everyone who asked those great questions. We will be including all the links that you saw on these slides in an email that's going to go out within the next, I'm going to aim for tomorrow. We'll say with that. So all these links on these upcoming courses, upcoming events, you will get that in your email along with some more resources from TechSoup. So with that, we bid all of you adieu, stay safe, be well, and we'll also have a survey. When you X out of this webinar, you'll be redirected to a survey. So just give us a little bit of feedback, should take a few moments, and we would greatly appreciate that. So with that,
here's some music. Let me, before you, I like it.
Love it. You really
all right,
know
guys.
how to rev engines.
Bye,
we appreciate
everybody.
you all. Be
Thank
well.
you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Wear a mask.
Yeah.
Bye.